Hi, you're watching Mindshifting Moments, a show that's working to destigmatize the psychedelic industry through transparent conversation and help you gain confidence in alternatives by asking questions and getting answers from experts who are hands on in the industry every day. I'm your host, Margaret Williamson, head of partnerships at Nucleus, a venture studio that's creating brands that educate people, aggregate data, and activate customers inside of the psychedelic space. Today's topic is that gray area between purpose and profit. It begs the question of, are psychedelics cultural appropriation? Is this just another example of colonial capitalism? Or are there ways that the future of psychedelics can respect its past? To help us answer that question today, I have an amazingly qualified guest, not only from his professional experience, but from his personal experience. He is the CEO and co founder of a next generation mental wellness company called Nue.Life. Please help me welcome Juan Pablo Cappello to Mind Shifting Moments. Hello, Juan Pablo. JP, how are you?
Great to see you, Margaret. Really appreciate you.
Yes, you too, you too. And you have a very extensive professional background. But today, I really want to lean on that personal experience that
Mm,
you've had, from your childhood all the way through your professional career, and obviously what has led you into the psychedelic industry today. And I thought, man, who better to talk about the kind of intersection of purpose and passion than you? So how should we start this off? I mean, it's such a big question. It's such a big topic.
sure.
Um, but I would say, from that, what is the best way for people to start to understand the true history of psychedelic medicine?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one a lot of people, quite honestly, struggle with. What I really feel is, with so many people, inspired by Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, the tremendous need for new therapies, given that you know, 60% of people who take antidepressants are still depressed.
Right.
And so, there's such a yearning for good solutions. And I really feel as Westerners, begin to experience the power and the magic of San Pedro, of ayahuasca, of ibogaine, and even of mushrooms, the more they understand actually the history um, of where these rituals have come from, and quite frankly, the suffering that has been associated, and the pain and the prejudice and the struggle that it's taken to get you know to where we are today. Actually, I feel like these rituals, these medicines, become all the more meaningful. And a lot of the concerns that you mentioned regarding cultural appropriation, et cetera, almost resolve themselves, because if you actually understand the struggle that it took to get where we are today, you really have a deeper appreciation of what people have gone through, and that, I think, by almost by definition, makes you a more empathetic, compassionate human. And so,
Right.
really, a lot of times, what I see is, people, Westerners, sometimes lack of sensitivity. It just comes from a place of ignorance, but it's very easy to understand the history and thus appreciate the rituals.
I agree. And you really kind of ding 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 hit it on the nose. And I think sometimes when we talk and we use that word ignorance, people's walls immediately go up. They're saying, how dare someone think of me that way? I'm not ignorant. But the reality is hey, we were never through our entire Western school system. If you were in the public school system or even the private school system, we just have a real lack when it comes to the education of indigenous cultures, of native tribes, Native Americans, for sure, but then the just world culture. And your role on the advisory board of a lot of these global initiatives and committees, I feel like
Mm.
has probably given you a perspective and a point of view that allows you to educate so many people in a compassionate way. And so I thank you for
Yeah,
that.
I would just point out that Christopher Columbus, in his first diary entry after coming in contact with indigenous people in the Americas, noted um, that they should be very easy to convert to Catholicism because it's very clear that they have no religion.
But that's,
And so this whole,
yeah.
right. And so, I mean, that was, over 400 years ago, right? And we still, literally in the 1990s, indigenous people of the North, of North America, were in a Supreme Court case. Basically, the Supreme Court of the United States rejected the notion that indigenous people of the North, that their practice of their religion, of their traditions, was in fact a religion. And thus Congress had to step in and approve the or grant the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, because literally our Supreme Court, while Clinton was in office, took that right back away from indigenous people. And we can talk a little bit about the history, but again, the more you understand the history, the richer actually these rituals become, because you understand where they came from.
I love it. I'm excited to dive right in. And, I want to approach this asking some of those questions that might be on the back of our minds, right? But when are we going to get the opportunity to ask them in a safe environment? And so my first one to start with is I like to change people's mindsets around fear, right? Because I really feel like fear is not necessarily what makes us fail, but it can make us fall down. It makes us stumble. It makes us afraid to take steps forward. And I think a lot of it is around when you talked about, right? We look at some of these rituals and we'll hear people chanting. We might see them in, teepees or under, huts. Just they look different from us, right? There's things that as Westerners, we don't put ourselves in situations like that. And so when we perceive something, we view it as different, and sometimes different is then put in this wrong basket. But help us to understand, are the same uses that we're seeing psychedelics being used for today in this resurgence or final acceptance in Western culture, are they the same as what indigenous tribes and communities were using the medicines for? Like to help?
Yeah, it's like so many, it's a great question. Like so many of these, my mother used to always say, the quality of your life is in direct proportion to the quality of the questions you're willing to ask yourself. So if you ask better, deeper questions, you have a better, deeper, more meaningful life. And so this question is so good, which is, hey, how much do the rituals today, how authentic are they? And how far can we sort of trace back their lineage? But here's what we really have to understand is that indigenous people of the North, I keep saying of the North and of the South because there's different traditions in the South. In the North, indigenous people tended to work with peyote, mescaline. And in the traditions of the South, which is the traditions I was exposed to as a child in Chile, we tend to work with San Pedro, which is also a mescaline containing cactus, and ayahuasca. But as we talk about the traditions of the North, what we have to keep in mind is those traditions go back at least 10,000 years, because they've found fossilized peyote buttons in ceremonial cups. So they know they were being used. But what we really have to acknowledge is by the 1860s, 1870s, a couple hundred years after contact, those traditions were lost. The indigenous people of the North at contact in 1491, there was about 100 million. Only debate is, was there 50 to 100 million? But I would say 100 million indigenous people in the Americas. By the 1880s, the end of the Indian American Wars, there was 5 million. So the only question was, did the numbers go from 100 million to 5 million, 90% destruction in a few hundred years? Or did it go from 50 million to 5 million? Doesn't really matter. But what happened is you had indigenous people who were essentially a defeated people. In one generation, they'd lost their way of life on the plains. They had lost their religion. Many of them were beginning to lose their language. And it was really in the 1870s, actually started in 1869 with the ghost dance, that indigenous people began to try to reclaim those traditions that were lost. The traditions that when we sit in ceremony all night with San Pedro, with peyote, those are, the lineage goes back to the 1870s. That's because it was almost like everything before then got lost. And so what's really interesting is that these ceremonies that we're expressing today, and I'm generalizing because there's hundreds of tribes, but there are some common themes, whether it's the Sioux, the Lakota, etc. Those traditions are traditions built out of that suffering, out of that loss. And those traditions were designed to help these people rise up and reclaim their identity, and rise up and reclaim, the strength, and rise up and reclaim who they really are.
Mm-hmm.
And what's beautiful about that is, if you actually understand that, when you sit in ceremony with these medicines and you feel the magic of these medicines, you realize that these are incredible rituals that really help us all rise up and all feel connected, both to the Great Spirit and to each other, because we start realizing there is no difference between the Great Spirit and each other. But that's so it's interesting. A lot of times Westerners think something's more authentic because it's older. And so they like to point back this 10,000 year history, and and that's what we're tapping into. And it's like, no, unfortunately, that history was mostly lost.
Right.
And then and it isn't for this podcast, but then you have to ask yourself, why was it lost? How was it lost? What does that say about who we are, right? But yeah, no, these traditions started in the late 1860s, 1870s, and they're beautiful. They're beautiful, beautiful rituals to heal that deep wound.
And then exactly. So then it kind of comes to where maybe the beginning, right? Pre-Columbus time, like the true indigenous millions of people, right? We just don't get to know. But if we are looking at this 1870s and a more modern history of psychedelics, then it seems like the answer is yes. They were using them for the
100%.
same, right, to solve the same kind of symptoms. And I love how you put that in your position at Nue.Life, that, hey, look, right, these addictions, these depressions, a lot of these things are just symptoms of something else, right? That we got to get to the root cause. And, Western medicine does a lot to help us mask and get rid of symptoms, but they just keep coming back, right? Because we're not doing that inner healing. And
Yeah, let
that's
me just point
yeah.
something out. People talk about depression, anxiety, and PTSD as if it's a disease. It's actually just a description of symptoms.
Right.
If I think about it, if I say you have cancer, I'm actually talking about a metabolic process that's occurring, right? If I say you have an infection, if I say you have a broken bone, I'm actually diagnosing an underlying condition. When I say somebody has depression, anxiety, or PTSD, just think about it. All I'm describing is how somebody feels, which is very important, but it's almost, if that's the beginning and the end of your diagnosis, then all you're going to ever treat is the symptoms, and you're never going to dig into the root cause. And that's what we're trying to solve for at Nue.Life.
Mm-hmm.
But quite honestly, with these indigenous traditions, that's what we're also trying to solve for. We're trying to bring people together and have them commune with the divine. And of course, ultimately, what people discover is they are the divine.
Right. Exactly. Right. I love that. And I'm so excited for everyone to reach that critical mass point. I just wonder if in some of these new modern settings, whether it's, at-home therapies, or it's, weekend retreats, or circles that we're doing at the end of a corporate conference, are we getting it? Do you know what I mean? Or are there parts of that traditional indigenous ritual that are they being incorporated into these new practices, or is it something that the business world is just saying, hey, that's not really part of the psychedelic experience?
Yeah, again, it's a great question. And it's a challenging question to answer. And given to be brief, I'll just point out a few sort of high level things to think about. One, I encourage Westerners who weren't really raised in these traditions to just acknowledge that the most they should be doing is trying to lead or organize almost the equivalent of an interdenominational church service.
Yeah.
And ideally just work with mushrooms and MDMA. There's not a lot of indigenous use of those medicines together, or there's none obviously of those medicines together. And that's like an authentic ritual. When I get very uncomfortable when I see Westerners working, with ayahuasca and San Pedro, Westerners shouldn't ever be working with peyote and even bufo. There's not really a true indigenous tradition. And so one, I just first off encourage Westerners, if they're going to work with some of these medicines, to work with the medicines, or at least the people who are leading those experiences, that you're working with medicines where you're not really muddling, authentic traditions that create these very specific containers. And then the other thing is, I actually love going to some of those rituals because I just take them as an interdenominational church service. So, at the beginning, I'm like, oh yeah, that's like a nod towards Buddhism and some of the traditions of the East. Then I hear something about the jaguar, and I'm like, oh, that's nice. They're tip of the hat to, the traditions of the South, the traditions of the condor. And then, they're talking about the Great Spirit. I'm like, oh, that's nice. There we go, the traditions of the North, the traditions of the eagle. And then maybe there's a nod to Catholicism. And it's just like, nice. It's, but I'm not feeling like somebody's trying to, pretend that, their grandfather has a lineage with, certain people of the Colombian Amazon, right? And so for me, a lot has to do with just, is the person who's leading the experience trying to appropriate an experience and a history which isn't really theirs? Because the reality is there's so much work and so much love that can be created in a much more authentic container where people are using different medicines and just acknowledging that they're creating this container. I mean, I came back from a mushroom retreat and sat down. We have an indigenous church in South Florida. And I sat down, we really followed the Lakota traditions. It's very rigorous, et cetera. And I really sat down with our spiritual family and said, we need more love in our ceremonies. And I know that's not part of the tradition we're following, but I saw so much love and so much healing in this other container. And we really need to bring a bit more of that love and light into what we're doing. So my point is, actually the indigenous traditions can learn from Western traditions, but only if the Western tradition, or what's these new containers that are being created are actually coming from an authentic place. And so there's, in psychedelics, unfortunately, just like in spirituality, there's a lot of inauthenticity, which, it's sort of just, I think human nature sometimes.
Those are great answers. So many, I feel like, mind shifting moments inside of that little segment. And, it got me thinking that, maybe the answer is kind of creating these new traditions, right? That can combine and incorporate some of these best practices, right? And so maybe that's a part of the freedom that we have in the future of psychedelics to look into the past, understand where the different plant medicines came from. Could you give us a picture?
Sure.
Say which, I want to hear your thought that was on the tip of your tongue, and then maybe lead us into some of those big regions. You touched on it briefly, kind of the medicines of the North, of the South. Some of them are African based.
And so what we have to keep in mind in the Americas, we had the Pan American Highway, which was the equivalent of the Silk Road. And so the same way the Silk Road really connected the East with the West, and much of, for instance, the silver and gold that was taken from the Americas went to Europe, but ultimately was traded for pepper, which is crazy, for pepper, and sent to the East. So China and India actually ended up with most of the gold and silver that was plundered from the Americas. Well, similarly, but much less violently, in the Americas, we had the equivalent of a Silk Road. It was called the Pan American Highway, and it went north to south, and they've found ayahuasca, which is a combination of two vines from the Amazon, as far north as the Dakotas. And they've found peyote buttons that pretty much just grow on the border between Texas and Mexico, as far south as the Patagonia in Argentina and in Chile. And so what's interesting, there was wide trade amongst the indigenous people. But generally speaking, the traditions of the North have centered around peyote, and that's why the Native American churches of the North are churches that used to be referred to as peyoteism. It's just that, it's easier to call something a church if you're not invoking peyote. In the traditions of the South, there were 7 cactuses that contained San Pedro, and the strongest of which were in Ecuador. And there was a San Pedro cactus in Chile, where I'm from. The driest desert in the world is called San Pedro de Atacama. It's often referred to as the Atacama Desert. It's actually San Pedro de Atacama. And one of the strongest, or the strongest, mescaline-containing cactus in the region was there in the desert, and the Spaniards basically made sure that it was harvested to extinction. And so you have these traditions around San Pedro, which grows quite quickly, and then ayahuasca, which is the combination of these two vines from the Amazon, whether it's the Brazilian or Colombian Amazon. And so those are the traditions. Bufo, 5-EMO-DMT, which hopefully people stop taking from toads and just start taking the synthetic, because it's completely not sustainable. Peyote buttons take 10 to 15 years to grow, so they could even be served in a ceremony, and ideally they'll grow 30 to 40 years. And so peyote is under a huge amount of stress. And again, Westerners really should not be working with peyote. Westerners shouldn't be working with, my perspective is, they shouldn't be working with the Sonoran toad venom. They should work with the synthetic. And the nice thing is there is no real indigenous use around 5-EMO. And again, Westerners can create beautiful, meaningful containers that are really authentic, that indigenous people can choose to experience or not. That's where we can learn a lot from each other.
Mm-hmm. So when you say, I want to make sure that I'm clear on it, that Westerners really shouldn't be working with some of these plant medicines. Is that because we should leave them to the indigenous tribes and those communities, or simply because we haven't yet figured out the right container to use them?
That's a great question. No, I'm referring to two I'd say two medicines that are, for different reasons, under stress and potentially endangered. So peyote buttons, because they're so slow growing, there's barely enough to allow real indigenous people to respect their own traditions and use peyote. And as soon as Westerners start consuming peyote, it means the little bit of the peyote fields that currently exist are going to be pillaged. Like, so much has been pillaged from indigenous people, and there's not going to be anything left for the indigenous people. And so peyote is sort of the one plant medicine that indigenous people do not want to be decriminalized, because they really feel that that's their sacrament. The 5-EMO DMT, which by the way has nothing to do with DMT, was sort of initially became a bit more popular and well known in the 1980s, and there's a very good synthetic. And the reality is, the harvesting of the medicine from the toads have put those populations, pushing them towards the brink of extinction in the not too distant future. And given that there's a very relatively easy molecule to synthesize, which is the active ingredient in the toad venom, I just encourage Westerners to not smoke the toad and and experiment and explore the synthetic, as it may not have the sort of plant spirit in it or the animal spirit in it, which is a shame. But what we have to recognize is, we live on a planet that needs to be in balance and in stasis, and we're overdoing it, as we often do as Westerners, with our insatiable consumption.
Yeah, I hear you, and that's what kind of led me. Is this just another example of, kind of colonial capitalism? We don't understand something, so we criminalize it until we can monetize it, and then we
Yeah.
exclude those people who taught it to us in the first place. But what I'm kind of gaining from this conversation is that there could be some separation, right? That we
Mm,
can look towards these indigenous tribes and communities and rituals and practices and start to understand, like you were saying, where did it come from? Why are they using these medicines? What is it doing for those people? And then take those learnings and apply it to some of these synthetic compounds that are being created through this, you know, this new technology and forward thinking next gen mental health and wellness, and kind of combine those practices, right? So maybe uh, we can incorporate the breath work, the mindfulness, the meditation,
right.
some of those practices, or am I missing the mark?
No, no, I think you're spot on. What I wanted to point out is, um, there's been a lot of debate in the indigenous community as to whether to allow non-indigenous people to participate in those rituals. Um, in the 1970s, you may know, there was AIM, there was the American Indian Movement, and it was really inspired by the civil rights movement, where indigenous people really yeah, acted up. There was a takeover of Wounded Knee, a sit-in. There were a number of sit-ins. There's actually, just like with the civil rights movement, violence, institutionalized government violence against the leaders of AIM. But it was interesting, one of the leaders, Leonard Crowdog, who died this past summer and was really a very, very important spiritual leader of the Lakotas. In the 70s, in the middle of AIM, there was this real move to exclude any Westerners from any partaking in any indigenous traditions. And Leonard Crowdog pointed out that they would start all of their prayers praying for all of God's creations. And he pointed out that if we're praying for all of God's creations, how can we exclude a well-intentioned Westerner or white man or woman to participate and respect our traditions? That what we really need to do is build a bridge of understanding. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's such an opportunity to, if we're willing to really understand these rituals, we're going to get so much more out of them. And also, if we really understand these rituals, we're going to be so much more grateful that these indigenous people, notwithstanding, that genocide that was committed, by many of our ancestors against these people, that they're willing to open up literally their hearts and their rituals and their religion and their spirituality to invite these people back in. So yeah, it's a very sort of nuanced and, like many of these things, complicated conversation. But the more you dig in, just the richer you realize it is.
Yeah, I love it. And to me, right, it just shows the power of these plant medicines, to say,
Aho, aho,
right at the end of it. Yeah,
aho. Absolutely.
amazing. So if there's, listeners that are feeling like, okay, I've sparked the curiosity. I want to learn
Mm.
and know more so I can have a deeper appreciation, understanding. Where's a good place for them to start? Are there resources out there about these topics?
Yeah, and one of so the traditions of the North, sitting with peyote and more recently San Pedro, really go back to the ghost dance. As I said, that began in 1869 on the reservations, and unfortunately culminated with the massacre at Wounded Knee, where 300 Lakota men, women, and children were gunned down by the U.S. government, who was essentially trying to put down what they perceived as a potential rebellion coming out of the ghost dance. And so there's two books that are really seminal books and really talk about the beginning of these traditions. One is called The Ghost Dance Religion and the Sioux Outbreak, and it's by James Moody, who is a Westerner who really did a huge amount to document and actually record the original, sort of ghost dance. And really, we have a lot to thank him for recognizing that this was really of cultural significance. I mean, just to give you an idea, at the time, the officers who murdered the Lakota at Wounded Knee, at the massacre at Wounded Knee, they all got awards by Congress for doing that. And it was only, about 100 years later that history was in fact corrected. So there's that book, and then there's a beautiful book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. And those are just two great tellings of the pain and the origin, and gives you a real sense of what life was on these reservations. Where 2 years before, there's a lot of debate that there was a huge typhoid epidemic, which wiped out many Indigenous people who had just gotten on the reservations, and that was, for a lot of people, sort of one of the inspirations for the ghost dance and the ghost dance religion. And just 1 second on that, do you mind if I just give a tiny history lesson? Because it's interesting. So the ghost dance was this sort of 3-day ecstatic dance, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs took it as the indigenous people on the reservation were beginning to plan a rebellion. And everyone would cite what happened in Haiti with the slave rebellion, like we cannot let this happen in the US. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs began to shut it down increasingly violently. And then at the Battle of Wounded Knee, they went after some very well-known leaders of the indigenous people at the time, including Chief Sitting Bull, which many people have heard of, and ended up ultimately killing about 300 men, women, and children, using one of the first versions of a machine gun, which is just horrific. So what did indigenous people do? Indigenous people realized, okay, that's too threatening to the authorities, but we really have to reclaim our traditions. And so what they began to do was celebrate their sacraments and their religion privately in the teepee, sitting in circle, instead of many drums beating at the same time, having one drum and one rattle happening at only one at a time, and doing it at night under cover of darkness, very privately, so as not to upset the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so when we sit in ceremony today, as we do, in front of a fire, in a circle, with a door, and you have to enter and exit the circle in a clockwise rotation, and we pray to the 4 directions, and all of this ritual, it is as if we're invoking that we're in a teepee. Well, why are we in a teepee at night, singing sacred songs all night with these beautiful medicines? Because of what happened with the ghost dance and what happened at Wounded Knee. And again, if you understand that that's a ritual that indigenous people were forced into,
right,
you suddenly you're sitting there at night and you get tired and your knees hurt, and you realize just what people had to go through to even find this uncomfortable space to celebrate their view of the world and their spirituality. Because what they wanted to be doing was to be dancing as a community ecstatically in this trance-like state out in the open. And they weren't able to do that because of our government's reaction to, their rituals. And by the way, history has shown that the ghost dance was nothing about planning a rebellion, and it was just all about just reclaiming their traditions. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because that's sort of the punchline that, and maybe that takes this conversation full circle, but that's what, the more you understand these rituals, the more you understand, the deep pain and also the deep healing that's in that fire.
So much. I mean, and then to understand that so many of the things that, to make a little bit of a jump, right? But if people try to interpret things all the time, I think, right? And so they saw then these indigenous tribes doing it, like you said, in the cover of darkness, in a small confined space, like keeping things quiet and private and tight. And then we try to take some of those things and say, like, okay, yes, it should be taken. These medicines should be done at night, and they're more of drugs, and they should, all of this stuff where we weren't
Right.
grasping the true set and setting that was intended for these plant medicines. And so it's just like, pshoom, definite a mind shift moment for me. Thank you so much for that. I feel like, okay, good. I feel better now. I feel like, I'm
yeah, I always joke, like, it's funny. I have to remind people sometimes that, hey, just showing up at a ceremony with no buttons or zippers, that's not like connecting you more deeply to these indigenous traditions. Like, save time shopping and use that time you would be shopping to find like the right tribal wear to show up in, and just read a little history. Just spend, like, I always feel, hey, this history isn't that complicated. I can break it down for you in 20 minutes and but I know people spend, oh my God, days trying to find like the right Instagrammable outfit to wear to ceremony. And then also just talk to me about the dieta. And it's like all good. Yeah, we gotta respect the traditions. But I'm like, yeah, the dieta is not, I think, nearly as important as understanding, why we're sitting at night, why we go around the fire 4 times with the medicine and 4 times with the songs. Right. Why are we praying to this water all night? And why in the morning, why are we being asked not to drink anything but medicine all night? People are sitting there, like, sometimes with a flask of water, sort of sneaking out to drink some water. And hey, that's cool. I'm not judging anyone. Right. But I'm like, I suspect the people who are doing that, don't quite understand, why we're praying to this water all night with our prayers of healing, with our prayers of compassion, with our prayers to our elders. Right. And after praying to that water collectively, and it's there next to the fire, then in the morning, after sunrise, we're drinking that water after not drinking for, say, 12 hours. That's magic. And the struggle, the uncomfortable feeling that we felt, in that moment when we're sharing that drink of water with our sacred family, it's incredible. And, so many people, because they don't understand where these traditions came from, unfortunately, just don't get as much out of these rituals as they could. So I'm not angry at them. I just, I know that they could, if they did a little bit more work, they could get so much more out of it.
Right. Amazing. So thank you for sharing this conversation with us today. It really enlightened me. I'm curious. I'm ready to learn more. And so I would say, yes, goal achieved. And again, for all of you who are listening and you're feeling the same way that I am, JP, Juan Pablo, is it okay for them to reach out to you? Can they connect with you
Sure.
on LinkedIn, or what's the best way for them to continue this conversation?
Yeah. So our company, Nue.Life.com, it's not, it's, I was trying to think, how do I leverage the, my experiences with psychedelics and healing generally, but how could we help a million people get at the root cause of their suffering, their anxiety, their depression, their PTSD? Understanding, unfortunately, because of really, prejudice by the U.S. government, we can't do that at scale within the construct of the Native American Church. But yeah, anyone who's interested can reach out to me at Nue.Life, JP, like Juan Pablo, at Nue.Life. That's my email. Follow me on Twitter. Active, in these virtual conversations. So very, very, very happy to keep the conversation going.
Wonderful. And if you're listening and you're not yet, you're beginning your journey in the psychedelic space and industry, or if you are already in the psychedelic industry and space, make sure that you claim your profile on Nucleus. We really are working at the intersection, forging these conversations, making sure that we can destigmatize the industry together so we can help millions of people on their path to well-being and mental wellness. So thank you guys. We will see you for the next mind shifting moment. Again, keep asking big questions. And like JP's mom said, right? Increase the quality of your life by increasing the quality of your questions. Until we see you guys again. Have a great day.
Aho, thank you.